The funeral home smelled of lilies and furniture polish, a combination that would forever remind me of the day I buried my husband of 23 years. I sat in the front row, my black dress feeling foreign against my skin, watching as people I barely recognized filed past Robert's casket, whispering condolences I couldn't quite hear over the ringing in my ears. "He was such a good man, Catherine." Mrs. Patterson from down the street squeezed my hand. I nodded and forced a smile, the same response I'd given to dozens of people over the past 3 days. Good man. The words felt hollow now, echoing in the space where my certainty used to live. My daughter Lisa sat beside me, her 25-year-old hand gripping mine tightly. She'd flown in from Denver the moment she heard, leaving her marketing job and her boyfriend behind. My son Michael, 22 and still finishing college, sat on my other side, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the lost expression of a young man who just realized his father wasn't invincible. "Mom, are you okay?" Lisa whispered, leaning close enough that I could smell her familiar lavender perfume mixed with the coffee she'd been living on since she arrived. I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay since I'd gotten the call from Mercy General Hospital 3 days ago, telling me that Robert had suffered a massive heart attack in his office. 52 years old, the picture of health according to his last physical just 6 months ago. The doctor said it was quick, he probably didn't suffer. That was supposed to be a comfort, but it felt more like a theft. No goodbye, no final words, no chance to say the things that had been building up inside me for months. The drive home from the cemetery was quiet, just the sound of tires on wet pavement and the occasional sniffle from the back seat where Michael sat staring out the window. Our house, a 2-story colonial in the suburbs of Minneapolis that Robert had insisted on buying when his construction business took off, looked smaller somehow, as if it had shrunk in his absence. "I'll stay tonight," Lisa announced as we walked through the front door, dropping her purse on the console table where Robert always left his keys. The absence of those keys felt like a physical ache. "You don't have to," I said, though I desperately wanted her to. The thought of being alone in our bedroom, surrounded by his clothes and his cologne and the book he'd never finished reading, made my chest tight. "I want to," she said firmly, and I recognized Robert's stubborn streak in the set of her jaw. That evening, we sat around the kitchen table picking at the casseroles that neighbors had dropped off, none of us really eating. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we didn't know how to say. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. "The lawyer called while we were getting ready this morning," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Harrison. He wants to schedule the reading of Dad's will." I nodded, though the thought of dealing with lawyers and paperwork felt overwhelming. "When?" He said whenever we're ready, but he mentioned it would be good to do it soon, for practical reasons. Practical reasons. Life insurance, bank accounts, the business, all the machinery of a life that needed to be dismantled and redistributed. I'd always let Robert handle the finances, trusting him to take care of everything while I focused on raising the kids and managing the household. Now I wished I'd paid more attention. "Let's do it tomorrow," I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness in my voice. "Better to get it over with." Lisa reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" I wasn't ready for any of this. I wasn't ready to be a widow at 50. I wasn't ready to figure out how to live in a house that felt too big and too quiet. I wasn't ready to make decisions about Robert's construction company, his tools, his truck that still smelled like sawdust and coffee. But ready or not, life was moving forward, and I had no choice but to move with it. "I'm sure," I said. That night, I lay in our bed, my bed now, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Every creak sounded different without Robert's steady breathing beside me. I found myself reaching across the mattress, my hand landing on cool sheets instead of his warm back. The hardest part wasn't the big moments of grief. It was the small things, making coffee for one instead of two, having no one to tell about the cardinal that kept tapping on the kitchen window, the way the silence stretched through dinner without his stories about difficult clients or problem job sites. I must have dozed off eventually, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds and the smell of bacon coming from downstairs. Lisa was already up, moving around the kitchen with the efficient grace she'd inherited from me, making breakfast for the 3 of us like she had every Saturday morning during high school. "Morning, Mom," she said when I appeared in the doorway, still in my robe. "I called Mr. Harrison. He can see us at 10. I poured myself coffee from the pot she'd made, stronger than Robert liked it, but perfect for me, and sat at the counter watching her work. She looked so much like I had at her age, all determined energy and careful competence. When had she become the one taking care of me? "Thank you," I said, and meant it for more than just a phone call. By 9:30, we were dressed and ready to face whatever legal complexities Robert had left behind. I wore the navy suit I'd bought for his company Christmas party last year, the one he'd said made my eyes look bluer. It felt like armor now, professional and proper for dealing with lawyers and paperwork. Harrison, Morrison, and Associates occupied the third floor of a downtown office building that still smelled faintly of the cigarettes that had been banned from the premises decades ago. Mr. Harrison himself was a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd handled Robert's business affairs for years, drawing up contracts and handling disputes with suppliers. "Catherine, I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. Robert was a good man and a good client. There was again, good man. I wondered if people would ever stop saying that, if I would ever stop flinching when they did. His office was wood-paneled and traditional, with law books lining the shelves and a view of the Minneapolis skyline through tall windows. We settled into leather chairs arranged around his desk, and he pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "Now, this should be fairly straightforward," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his glasses. Robert was very thorough in his planning, very organized. "Always thinking ahead, your husband." He opened the folder and began reading in the formal language of legal documents, explaining about the life insurance policies, the retirement accounts, the house that was already in both our names. It was all very reasonable, very Robert, everything divided carefully and logically, with provisions for the kids' education and my financial security. I found my mind wandering as he read, thinking about how characteristic this was of my husband. Even in death, he was taking care of everything, making sure all the loose ends were tied up. It should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel oddly distant from the whole proceedings, as if I were watching someone else's life being parceled out and distributed. The business would need to be sold, Mr. Harrison explained. Robert's partner Tom would have first option to buy it, which made sense. They'd worked together for 15 years, building the company from a two-man operation working out of Robert's garage to a crew of 20 with contracts all over the Twin Cities. The proceeds from the sale, along with the life insurance and other assets, should leave you quite comfortable financially, Mr. Harrison said, looking up from the documents with a reassuring smile. Comfortable, as if money could fill the space where my husband used to be. "Are there any questions so far?" he asked. Lisa and Michael both looked at me. I shook my head. It all seemed clear enough, if overwhelming. I would need to find an accountant, figure out how to manage investments I'd never had to think about before. But that was tomorrow's problem. "Good," Mr. Harrison said, shuffling through the remaining papers. "Now, there are just a few final items to address." He was lifting another document from the folder when his phone rang. He glanced at it apologetically. "I'm sorry, I need to take this quickly. It's about the Peterson case. They've been waiting for a call back." He answered the phone, speaking in low tones about depositions and court dates. I used the interruption to look around his office more carefully. There were family photos on his desk. A woman who must be his wife, grandchildren in various stages of growing up, diplomas and certificates on the walls, awards from the Minnesota Bar Association. This was a life built on careful attention to detail, on dotting I's and crossing T's. It felt solid and permanent in a way that my own life suddenly didn't. When he hung up, Mr. Harrison looked slightly flustered. I apologized for the interruption. "Now, where were we?" He shuffled through the papers again, found his place. "Ah, yes, just a few final provisions to cover." He cleared his throat and continued reading from what appeared to be the last page of the will. Something about charitable donations, a small bequest to Robert's sister in Oregon. Standard stuff, the kind of generous but modest gestures that were typical of my husband. I was already mentally preparing to leave, thinking about the lunch Lisa had promised to make and the phone calls I'd need to return, when Mr. Harrison's voice took on a different tone. "And here we have one final item," he said, his voice becoming more careful, more measured. He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read something between sympathy and discomfort. "What is it?" I asked, though something in his manner was making my stomach clench with a familiar dread. Mr. Harrison looked down at the document again, then back at me. "Well, there's a provision here for another beneficiary." The room seemed to get quieter, as if even the traffic noise from the street below had stopped. Lisa shifted in her chair beside me. "What kind of provision?" I heard myself ask. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable. He's left a sum of $50,000 to someone named Vanessa Miller." The name hit me like a physical blow. Vanessa Miller. I knew that name, though I tried for months to push it out of my mind. The woman who worked at the bank where Robert did business for the company. The woman who was always so friendly when I went in with him, always so quick to compliment my dress or ask about the kids. The woman who had called our house 6 months ago, late one evening when Robert was in the shower, asking if he was available to discuss some banking matters. When I told her he wasn't available and asked if she could call back tomorrow during business hours, she'd hesitated just a moment too long before saying, of course, that would be fine. "I'm sorry," Mr. Harrison was saying, "but the will specifically states that this bequest is for Ms. Miller," described as he paused, looking even more uncomfortable. "As someone who provided special personal and professional support to Robert during his final years." Special personal support. The euphemism hung in the air between us like smoke. Michael was staring at me, his face confused. Lisa had gone very still beside me, her hand tightening on the arm of her chair. "I don't understand," Michael said. "Who is Vanessa Miller?" But I understood. God help me, I understood perfectly. All those late nights at the office, all those weekend business meetings, all those times Robert had seemed distant and distracted. The way he'd started dressing better, paying more attention to his appearance. The new cologne I'd noticed but hadn't questioned. The way he'd stopped really seeing me, stopped talking to me about anything beyond schedules and household logistics. The way our conversations had become polite and surface level, like we were acquaintances rather than spouses who had built a life together. "Mom!" Lisa's voice seemed to come from very far away. I looked at Mr. Harrison, who was watching me with the careful expression of someone who had delivered this kind of news before. How long had this provision been in the will? He consulted the document. This was added about 8 months ago, in a codicil to the original will. 8 months ago! Right around the time I'd started feeling like I was living with a stranger. "I'm very sorry, Catherine," Mr. Harrison said gently. "I know this must be difficult to hear." Difficult. Another inadequate word for something that was rearranging my understanding of my entire marriage, my entire life. I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady despite the way the room seemed to be tilting around me. "Is there anything else?" "No, that concludes the will reading. But Catherine, if you need time to process this, we can discuss the practical implications later." "What practical implications?" I asked. "Well, you'll need to contact Ms. Miller about the bequest. And there may be other matters to discuss. Sometimes in situations like this." He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. Sometimes the wife wasn't the only one with claims on the husband's estate. Sometimes there were complications. "I see," I said. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrison." Lisa and Michael followed me out of the office in stunned silence. We didn't speak until we were in the elevator, and then Michael exploded. "What the hell was that about? Who is this woman? Why would Dad leave money to some random bank employee?" I looked at my son, this young man who still believed his father was a hero, who had inherited Robert's straightforward view of the world where things were either right or wrong, black or white. How do you tell your child that the man they idolized was not the man any of us thought he was? "She wasn't random," I said quietly. The elevator doors opened onto the parking garage, and we walked to Lisa's rental car in silence. It wasn't until we were all inside, doors closed against the outside world, that Lisa finally spoke. "Mom," she said, her voice very careful. "Are you saying Dad was having an affair?" I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the headrest. 23 years of marriage, and it came down to this sitting in a parking garage, trying to find words to explain to my children that their father had been living a double life. "I think so," I said finally. "Yes, I think he was." The silence that followed was different from the grief-stricken quiet of the past few days. This was the silence of a family trying to absorb a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about themselves. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the past 2 years, looking for signs I'd missed, clues I'd ignored. They were all there. Now that I was looking the gradual shift from husband to housemate, the way Robert had become a stranger living in my house, polite and distant and increasingly absent. By dawn, I'd made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to find Vanessa Miller and ask her directly about my husband. Lisa found me in the kitchen at 6 a.m., fully dressed and making coffee with the grim efficiency of someone preparing for battle. "Mom, you can't seriously be thinking of confronting this woman," she said, though her tone suggested she already knew that was exactly what I was thinking. "I need to know," I said, not looking up from measuring coffee grounds. "I need to know what happened, how long it went on." If I stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. If what? If he loved her? If our entire marriage was a lie? If there was anything left of the man I thought I'd been married to for over 2 decades? "I just need to know," I repeated. Lisa sat down at the counter, studying my face. She had always been the more cautious of my 2 children, the one who thought things through before acting. "What if she won't talk to you? What if she doesn't want to see you? Then I'll deal with that. What if what she tells you makes everything worse?" I poured coffee into 2 mugs, adding cream to hers the way she'd liked it since she was 12 years old. How could it be worse than not knowing? Michael appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up and his eyes still heavy with sleep. At 22, he could still sleep through almost anything, but apparently family crisis was stronger than his usual comatose morning state. "Are you guys talking about the woman from yesterday?" he asked, accepting the coffee I handed him. "Your mother wants to go see her," Lisa said. Michael frowned. "Why would you want to do that? How do you explain to your children that sometimes the only way forward is through the truth, no matter how much it hurts? That living with questions is worse than living with painful answers? Because I was married to your father for 23 years, and apparently I didn't know him at all," I said. "Because he left her $50,000, and I need to understand what that means." "It means he was cheating," Michael said bluntly. "What else is there to understand?" But it wasn't that simple. If Robert had been having an affair, why acknowledge it in his will? Why not just hide it? Take the secret to his grave? The fact that he'd made Vanessa Miller a beneficiary suggested something more complicated than a simple extramarital fling. "I found her address," I said, pulling out my phone where I'd already looked up Vanessa Miller in the Minneapolis area. There were 3 of them, but only one worked at First National Bank. Lisa sighed. "If you're determined to do this, I'm coming with you." "You don't have to." "Mom, you're not doing this alone." Michael set down his coffee mug with a decisive clink. "I'm coming too." I started to protest, but the look on his face stopped me. Despite his youth, despite his tendency to see the world in simple terms, he was a grown man. And Robert had been his father too. 2 hours later, we were parked across the street from a modest ranch house in Bloomington, a suburb south of Minneapolis. The neighborhood was middle-class and quiet, with well-maintained lawns and minivans and driveways. It looked like the kind of place where people lived ordinary, uncomplicated lives. Vanessa Miller's house was pale yellow with white trim, a small garden in front filled with late-blooming mums in shades of rust and gold. There was a silver Honda Accord in the driveway, practical, reliable, the kind of car a bank employee might drive. "That's her," Lisa said quietly. A woman had emerged from the house, pulling on a light jacket as she walked toward the Honda. Even from across the street, I could see that she was younger than me, probably mid-30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and a slim figure in a gray skirt and white blouse. She moved with the brisk confidence of someone running slightly late for work. She was pretty in an understated way, the kind of woman who would be easy to overlook in a crowd but memorable once you really looked at her. I could see why Robert might have been attracted to her. What I couldn't see was why he would risk everything we'd built together for someone who looked so ordinary. "Should we go talk to her now?" Michael asked. I watched Vanessa Miller back out of her driveway and drive away toward what I assumed was her job at the bank. The bank where she would spend her day helping customers with their financial needs, being professional and friendly and helpful, just as she'd always been when Robert and I came in together. Had she known who I was those times? Had she stood there smiling at me? asking about my children and my plans for the weekend, all while sleeping with my husband? Not at work, I said. Tonight, after she gets home. We spent the day in a strange kind of limbo, going through the motions of normal life while the weight of what we'd learned pressed down on everything. Lisa called her office to extend her leave. Michael paced around the house like a caged animal, picking up objects and setting them down without really seeing them. I found myself going through Robert's things with new eyes: his dresser drawers, his side of the closet, the papers in his desk in the home office we'd set up in what used to be Michael's bedroom. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Love letters? Receipts from restaurants I'd never been to? Evidence of a secret life I'd been too blind to see? What I found was more mundane and somehow more devastating. Credit card statements showing charges at a jewelry store downtown, a purchase made 3 months ago for $847. I'd never received any jewelry. His cell phone, which I'd never thought to check before, protected by a passcode I didn't know. A receipt from a hotel in downtown Minneapolis, dated just 6 weeks ago, for a weekend when he told me he was visiting his sister in Oregon. Each discovery was like a small paper cut, insignificant on its own, but adding up to something that made it hard to breathe. By 5 o'clock, we were parked across from Vanessa Miller's house again, waiting for her to come home from work. The autumn sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street. A few neighbors were out walking dogs or bringing in mail, but no one paid any attention to the 3 people sitting in a car, working up the courage to confront the other woman. She pulled into her driveway at 5:47 p.m., the silver Honda looking exactly the same as it had that morning. She sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine, and I wondered if she was having the same kind of day we were, trying to process impossible information, trying to figure out how to move forward when everything had changed. "There she is," Lisa said unnecessarily. We watched her walk to her front door, fishing keys from a purse that looked expensive but not flashy. She moved with the slightly weary gait of someone who'd spent 8 hours on her feet, dealing with other people's problems. "Should we wait a few minutes? Let her get settled?" Michael asked, but I was already getting out of the car. If I waited any longer, I might lose my nerve entirely. The walk across the street and up her front sidewalk felt endless. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she'd be able to hear it when she answered the door. Behind me, I could hear Lisa and Michael's footsteps, their presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. This was not a conversation I'd ever imagined having, certainly not with my children as witnesses. I rang the doorbell before I could change my mind. The woman who opened the door was even prettier up close, with clear skin and hazel eyes that widened with recognition when she saw me. She knew who I was. That answered one question, at least. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice soft and slightly breathless. What are you doing here?" So she did know my name. She knew exactly who I was, and what I represented: the wife of the man she'd been sleeping with, the woman whose life she'd helped destroy. "I think you know why I'm here," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Vanessa Miller glanced past me to Lisa and Michael, then back to my face. Something flickered in her expression: guilt, fear, resignation. "Would you like to come in?" she asked quietly. Her living room was tastefully decorated in soft blues and grays, with framed photographs on the mantel and books arranged neatly on built-in shelves. It was the home of someone who lived alone but took care with her surroundings, someone who valued order and beauty in small doses. What struck me most was how normal it all looked. I don't know what I'd been expecting: something more obviously the lair of a homewrecker, perhaps. Instead, it looked like the home of any single professional woman, comfortable but not extravagant, personal but not intimate. We sat across from each other in matching armchairs, Lisa and Michael flanking me on the sofa like bodyguards. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Vanessa Miller finally spoke. "I know you must hate me," she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't hate you," I said, and realized it was true. What I felt was more complicated than hate: a mixture of curiosity, betrayal, and something that might have been pity. "I just need to understand." She nodded, not meeting my eyes. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How it started, how long it lasted, whether Robert had loved her more than he'd loved me, whether our entire marriage had been a lie or just the end of it. How long?" I asked instead. 2 years, she said quietly. A little over 2 years. 2 years. While I was planning our 20th wedding anniversary party, worrying about Michael's college applications, thinking about whether we should renovate the kitchen. 2 years of living with a stranger who came home to me every night after spending his days with her. How did it start? Vanessa Miller. I realized I should probably start thinking of her by her first name, since we were apparently going to have this conversation. Looked up at me with an expression of genuine regret. He came into the bank one day to discuss a business loan. This was about 3 years ago. We got to talking, and he mentioned that that you were going through a difficult time with your mother's illness. My mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's 3 years ago. I'd spent months driving back and forth to Duluth, helping my father figure out care options, dealing with doctors and lawyers, and the heartbreak of watching the woman who raised me disappear bit by bit. It had been one of the hardest periods of my life, and I'd leaned on Robert for support, grateful for his patience and understanding. Apparently, while I thought he was being supportive, he was using my grief as an opening to get sympathy from another woman. He seemed lonely, Vanessa continued. He talked about how worried he was about you, how hard it was to watch you go through that pain and not be able to fix it. The irony was almost laughable. Robert, the fixer, the man who could solve any construction problem and negotiate any difficult contract, had been frustrated by his inability to cure my mother's disease or ease my suffering. So instead of just being present with me in that pain, he found someone else to make him feel useful and appreciated. So you decided to comfort him, Lisa said, her voice sharp with anger. Vanessa flinched. It wasn't like that. At least, not at first. We just talked. He would come into the bank more often than he really needed to, and we would talk about work, about life. He was easy to talk to, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. I knew that about Robert. He was a good listener, at least when he wanted to be. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room when he focused his attention on you. I'd fallen in love with that quality when we were young, the way he could make me feel seen and valued and understood. When did it become more than talking? I asked. Vanessa's cheeks flushed pink. About a year after we met. We started having lunch together sometimes, just as friends. Then one day, she trailed off, shaking her head. I know how this sounds. I know what you must think of me. But I didn't set out to have an affair with a married man. It just happened. Things like that don't just happen, Michael said harshly. You made choices. You're right, Vanessa said, looking directly at him for the first time. We both made choices. Bad choices that hurt people we cared about. Did he talk about leaving me? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting in her lap. Sometimes, she said finally, but he also talked about how much he loved you and the kids. He was torn. He felt guilty about what we were doing, but he also felt like he couldn't stop. This was almost worse than a simple affair. At least if Robert had fallen out of love with me completely, I could understand his actions. But to know that he'd loved me while betraying me, that he'd been torn between his family and his mistress, that felt like a deeper violation somehow. Why did he put you in his will? Lisa asked. This was the question that had been bothering me the most. If Robert had wanted to keep the affair secret, why leave evidence of it in a legal document that his family would inevitably see? Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. He was worried about me, she said softly. I don't make much money at the bank, and I don't have family here. He knew that if something happened to him, I'd be alone. He wanted to make sure I'd be okay. So he was planning to provide for you after he was gone, I said. He said he owed me that much. For all the time we'd spent together, she stopped, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. For what? For asking me to wait, she said quietly. He kept saying he was going to figure things out, that he was going to find a way for us to be together without hurting anyone. But he never did, and then he was gone, and I realized he never would have. The room fell silent again. Outside, I could hear the sound of children playing in someone's backyard, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Normal life, continuing on while we sat here dissecting the ruins of mine. Did he love you? I asked, the words coming out before I could stop them. Vanessa looked at me with something like compassion. He thought he did, she said. But I think what he really loved was the idea of me. The person he could be when he was with me younger, more spontaneous, less responsible for everyone else's happiness. It was a more honest answer than I'd expected, and somehow it hurt less than a simple yes would have. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Vanessa said. "And I certainly never meant for you to find out this way. I've been dreading this conversation since the will reading." "You knew we'd find out from the will." "Robert told me he'd provided for me, but I don't think he really thought through what that would mean for your family. He was always better at solving immediate problems than thinking through long-term consequences." That was true. Robert had been a man who lived in the present, dealing with whatever crisis was right in front of him without always considering how his actions might affect the future. It was one of the things that had made him a successful businessman, his ability to make quick decisions and move forward without second-guessing himself. But it had also made him the kind of person who could justify an affair by telling himself he'd figure out the implications later. "What happens now?" Michael asked. It was a good question. What did happen now? I was still legally entitled to contest the will, to argue that Robert wasn't of sound mind when he made provisions for his mistress. But did I want to? Did I want to drag this whole mess through probate court, make our private pain public record? "I don't want the money," Vanessa said suddenly. "I know you probably don't believe me, but I don't. I never wanted anything from Robert except—" She stopped, shaking her head. "Except what?" "Except for him to choose me," she said simply. "But he never did, and now he never can. The money won't change that." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but all I saw was genuine grief. She had lost Robert too, in a way. She'd lost the future she'd been hoping for, the relationship she'd been waiting for him to commit to fully. "The money is legally yours," I said. "Robert wanted you to have it. I don't feel right taking it. Not from his family." But I was beginning to understand why Robert had left it to her. It wasn't just guilt, though that was certainly part of it. It was his way of taking care of everyone, even after he was gone. He'd made sure I would be financially secure, and he'd made sure she wouldn't be left with nothing after 2 years of waiting for a future that was never going to materialize. It was typically Robert trying to solve everyone's problems with money and practical arrangements, not understanding that some problems can't be solved that way. "Keep it," I said, standing up. "Use it to start over somewhere else, if that's what you want. Or stay here and build whatever life you're going to build. But don't keep it out of guilt." Vanessa looked up at me with surprise. "I don't understand." "Robert made his choice when he put you in that will," I said. "He chose to acknowledge what you meant to him, even if it meant hurting his family. The least I can do is respect that choice." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I wasn't sure I was capable of forgiving either of them yet. But it was acceptance. Acceptance that this was the reality I had to live with now, and that fighting it wouldn't bring Robert back or undo the choices he'd made. "Thank you," Vanessa said softly. I nodded and headed toward the door, Lisa and Michael following behind me. As I reached for the handle, Vanessa spoke again. "Mrs. Thompson? Catherine." I turned back. "For what it's worth, he really did love you. Even when he was with me, he talked about you all the time. About how proud he was of the mother you were, how strong you were during your mother's illness, how much he admired your resilience. I think he never really believed he deserved you. It was meant as a kindness, but it hit me like a slap. If Robert had thought I was so wonderful, why had he needed someone else? If he'd admired my strength and resilience, why hadn't he trusted me enough to be honest about his unhappiness? But there was no point in asking those questions now. The man who could have answered them was gone. "Goodbye, Vanessa," I said, and walked out into the cool evening air. The drive home from Vanessa's house was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was replaying every word of the conversation, trying to piece together a picture of the man I'd been married to. The Robert that Vanessa described lonely, torn, trying to be everything to everyone was recognizable, but he was also a stranger. When we pulled into our driveway, the house looked different somehow. The same 2-story colonial with its neat landscaping and attached garage, but now it felt like a stage set rather than a home. How many nights had Robert sat at our dinner table, listening to me talk about my day, while thinking about her? How many times had he kissed me goodbye in the morning before heading off to see his other life? "I need some air," I said as we got out of the car. Instead of going inside, I walked around to the backyard, where Robert had spent countless weekends building the deck, planting the garden, installing the swing set when the kids were small. Lisa found me sitting on the deck steps 20 minutes later, staring at the vegetable garden where tomatoes still hung heavy on the vine, unpicked since Robert's death. "How are you doing, Mom?" she asked, settling down beside me. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I keep thinking I should feel angrier, but mostly I just feel tired." "You have every right to be angry." "Do I?" "I mean, yes, he lied to me. Yes, he betrayed our marriage. But he's also dead, Lisa. What's the point of being angry at a dead man?" Lisa was quiet for a moment, watching a neighbor's cat pick its way delicately through the fallen leaves. "Maybe the point is that your feelings matter too. You don't have to protect his memory at the expense of processing what he did to you." It was wisdom beyond her 25 years, and I wondered when my daughter had become the one offering me guidance. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," I said, or maybe didn't want to see. The way he started working out more, buying new clothes. How he'd come home from work, smelling like different soap. The way he started putting his phone face down on the counter. "You weren't supposed to be looking for signs," Lisa said firmly. "You were supposed to be able to trust your husband." Michael appeared around the corner of the house, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I can't find Dad's tools," he said without preamble. "What do you mean you can't find them?" "I went to look in the garage, thinking maybe I could finish that shelf he was building for the basement. But his toolbox isn't there. His good tools, the ones he always used for projects around the house, they're all gone." I frowned, trying to remember when I'd last seen Robert's tools. He'd been particular about them, investing in high-quality equipment and keeping everything organized in a red Craftsman toolbox that had been his pride and joy. Maybe he lent them to someone? Who? Tom has his own tools at the business, and Dad never let anyone borrow his personal tools. You know how he was about that. I did know. Robert had been almost obsessive about his tools, cleaning them after each use and returning them to their designated spots. The idea that he'd lent them out was unlikely. "I'll call Tom tomorrow," I said. Maybe Robert moved them to the work site for some reason. But even as I said it, I had a sinking feeling that Tom wouldn't know anything about the missing tools. That night, I found myself going through the house more systematically, looking for other things that might be missing or out of place. Robert's good watch, the one I'd given him for our 15th anniversary, wasn't in his jewelry box. Neither was the gold ring he'd inherited from his grandfather. His laptop, which he'd always kept on the desk in our home office, was gone too. I'd assumed he'd had it with him at work when he died, but when I called Tom, he said Robert hadn't brought his personal laptop to the office in months. "Catherine, is everything okay?" Tom asked. "You sound stressed." Tom Rodriguez had been Robert's business partner for 15 years. A good man, honest and hardworking, who'd helped Robert build the construction company from nothing into one of the most respected contractors in the Twin Cities. If anyone would know about Robert's recent behavior, it would be Tom. "Tom, did Robert seem different to you lately?" "In the months before he died." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Different how?" "I don't know. Distracted, maybe. Secretive." Another pause. "Catherine, is there something specific you're trying to figure out? Because if there's something I need to know about the business." "It's not about the business," I said, though I was beginning to wonder if it might be. "I'm just trying to understand some things about Robert's finances. There are some discrepancies I'm trying to sort out." "What kind of discrepancies?" I wasn't ready to tell Tom about Vanessa, about the affair and the money Robert had left her. But the missing tools, the laptop, the jewelry, they suggested something else was going on, something beyond infidelity. "Money that's not where it should be," I said carefully. "Things that are missing from the house. I'm wondering if Robert might have been having financial problems he didn't tell me about." "Not that I know of," Tom said immediately. "The business is solid, Catherine. We've got contracts lined up through next spring, and the books are clean." Robert was always careful about keeping his personal finances separate from the company. "What about his behavior at work? Had he been acting strangely?" Tom was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking, trying to decide how much to tell me. "He'd been taking more personal time," he said finally. "Long lunches, leaving early some days. But I figured he was dealing with stress from your mother's situation, maybe planning something special for your anniversary coming up. You know how Robert was about making sure everything was perfect for you." "Perfect?" The word felt like a joke now. Robert had been so concerned with appearing perfect, with maintaining the facade of being the ideal husband and father, that he created an entire secret life rather than admit he was unhappy. After I hung up with Tom, I sat in Robert's office, my office now, I suppose, and tried to think logically about what might have happened to his missing belongings. The most obvious explanation was that he'd sold them or given them away, but why would he do that? And why wouldn't he have told me? Unless he needed money for something he couldn't explain. Something like maintaining a second relationship or dealing with some kind of financial pressure I didn't know about. I opened Robert's filing cabinet and started going through his papers more carefully than I had before. Bank statements, insurance policies, tax returns, everything seemed normal at first glance. But as I dug deeper, I found some things that made me uneasy. Credit card statements for a card I didn't know about, with charges at restaurants, hotels, and jewelry stores. A second checking account with my name listed as a beneficiary, but which I'd never heard of before. Investment statements for accounts that showed significantly less money than I'd expected based on our conversations about retirement planning. The numbers didn't add up. According to the financial picture Mr. Harrison had presented during the will reading, Robert had left us well provided for. But the more I looked at the actual accounts, the more I realized that a significant amount of money was simply missing. Lisa found me at the desk at midnight, surrounded by papers and printouts, trying to make sense of Robert's financial maze. "Mom, you should get some sleep," she said. "I can't sleep. Look at this." I showed her the investment statements. According to these, Robert cashed out most of his retirement funds 6 months ago. But the money isn't in any of our joint accounts. Lisa studied the papers, her marketing background making her more comfortable with numbers than Michael was. "Where did it go?" "I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out." She pulled up a chair beside me, and together we went through everything again. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Over the past year, Robert had systematically liquidated assets, closed accounts, and moved money around in ways that made it difficult to track. "It's like he was preparing for something," Lisa said. "Like what?" "I don't know. Maybe he was planning to leave? Maybe he and Vanessa were going to run away together. But that didn't feel right either. If Robert had been planning to leave me for Vanessa, why would he have cashed out accounts that were supposed to provide for my future? And why put her in his will if he was planning to be alive, to take care of her himself? "Mom," Lisa said slowly, "what if Robert was in some kind of trouble? What if someone was pressuring him for money?" The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but now that she mentioned it, it made a horrible kind of sense. The secretiveness, the missing belongings, the liquidated assets had all pointed to someone under pressure, trying to raise cash quickly and quietly. What kind of trouble could he have been in? Gambling debts? Business problems he didn't tell Tom about? Maybe someone was blackmailing him about the affair. Each possibility was worse than the last. I thought the worst thing I'd learn about Robert was that he'd been unfaithful. But what if infidelity was just the beginning? The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison and asked him to come to the house. If Robert had been hiding financial problems, I needed professional help to figure out how bad things really were. Harrison arrived at 10 o'clock, looking concerned and carrying a leather briefcase that gave him an air of competent authority. I'd laid out all the papers I'd found on the dining room table, and he spent an hour going through them methodically, asking questions and making notes. "This is concerning," he said finally, looking up at me over his reading glasses. "It appears that Robert liquidated approximately $300,000 in assets over the past 18 months. $300,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Where did it go? That's what we need to find out. Some of it I can trace. There are transfers to accounts that appear to be related to Ms. Miller, totaling about $60,000 over the course of the relationship. So Robert hadn't just left Vanessa money in his, well, he'd been supporting her throughout their affair. The discovery should have made me angrier, but instead I just felt hollow. What about the rest? The rest is more difficult to track. There are cash withdrawals, cashier's checks, transfers to accounts that have since been closed. It's the kind of pattern you see when someone is trying to move money without leaving a clear trail. Why would Robert do that? Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, the gesture giving him time to think. "There are several possibilities," he said finally. "He might have been involved in some kind of business deal that he wanted to keep separate from your joint finances. He might have been planning to leave and was setting up funds for a new life. Or what? Or he might have been paying someone. Blackmail, gambling debts, loan sharks. There are people who prefer cash transactions and don't provide receipts. The room felt cold suddenly, despite the warm October sun streaming through the windows. I wrapped my sweater more tightly around myself. How do we find out which one it was? We can hire a forensic accountant to trace the money trail, Harrison said. And I'd recommend talking to the police. If Robert was being extorted or threatened, there might be a criminal element to this that needs to be investigated. The police. The idea of involving law enforcement in Robert's affairs, of making our private family crisis a matter of public record, made me feel sick. What if I don't want to know? I asked quietly. What if I just want to let it go? Harrison looked at me with sympathy. I understand the impulse, Catherine. But if there's a criminal element to this, it might not be over just because Robert is gone. If he owed money to the wrong kind of people, they might come looking for it from his estate. From you. The thought hadn't occurred to me that Robert's secrets might have put me in danger, might continue to affect my life even after his death. Besides, Harrison continued gently, you deserve to know the truth about your husband's financial affairs. You're going to be making decisions about your future based on what assets are actually available to you. You need accurate information to do that. He was right, of course. I couldn't make informed decisions about my life if I didn't know what resources I actually had, or what debts or obligations Robert might have left behind. Okay, I said. Let's find out what happened. That afternoon, Harrison connected me with a forensic accountant named Patricia Wells, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of calm competence that comes from years of unraveling other people's financial messes. She came to the house that evening and spent 3 hours going through Robert's papers with the methodical thoroughness of a detective. Your husband was very clever about hiding money trails, she said as she packed up her laptop and files. But nobody's perfect. Give me a week, and I'll have a clearer picture of where that money went. A week felt like an eternity, but I had no choice but to wait. In the meantime, I tried to go through the motions of normal life, returning condolence calls, dealing with insurance companies, sorting through Robert's clothes and personal belongings. But everything felt different now. Every sympathy card, every casserole dropped off by a neighbor, every "he was such a good man" comment felt like a reminder of how wrong everyone was about Robert, how wrong I'd been about my own life. Michael went back to college on Thursday, unable to postpone his classes any longer. He hugged me tightly before getting in his car, and I could see the worry in his eyes. "Are you sure you're going to be okay, Mom?" he asked. "I'm sure," I lied. Because what else could I tell him? That I was beginning to suspect his father had been living a double life that was far more complicated than a simple affair? That I was scared about what else we might discover? Lisa stayed through the weekend, helping me pack up Robert's office and clear out his side of the bedroom closet. We worked mostly in silence, the mundane tasks of sorting clothes and papers providing a distraction from the larger questions hanging over us. On Sunday evening, as we were taping up the last box of Robert's belongings, Lisa asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mom, what are you going to do if we find out Dad was in serious trouble? If he owed money to dangerous people?" I set down the tape dispenser and looked at my daughter, this strong, capable young woman who'd put her own life on hold to help me through the worst week of my life. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I guess we'll figure it out when we get there." But privately, I was terrified. I thought the worst thing about Robert's death was losing him. Then I thought the worst thing was discovering his affair. Now I was beginning to realize that we might have only scratched the surface of his secrets, and I had no idea how deep they went or how much damage they might still do. Patricia Wells called on Tuesday morning with the tone of someone delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. "Can you come to my office this afternoon?" she asked. I'd rather discuss what I found in person. The downtown Minneapolis office building where Patricia worked was all glass and steel, the kind of place where serious financial business got conducted in conference rooms with views of the Mississippi River. She met me in the lobby herself, which somehow made me more nervous than if she'd sent an assistant. "Thank you for coming in, Catherine," she said as we rode the elevator to the 14th floor. "I know this has been a difficult time for you." Her office was neat and impersonal, with diplomas on the walls and stacks of files that spoke of other people's financial secrets. She gestured for me to sit in one of 2 chairs facing her desk, then settled behind her computer with the air of someone about to deliver a diagnosis. "I'm afraid what I found is more complicated than a simple case of marital infidelity," she began. My stomach clenched. "How complicated?" Patricia turned her monitor so I could see the spreadsheet she created, rows and columns of numbers that represented the dismantling of my financial security. "Over the past 18 months, your husband liquidated approximately $340,000 in assets," she said. "Retirement accounts, investment funds, the equity line of credit on your house. He essentially cashed out everything he could get his hands on." The number was even higher than Mr. Harrison had estimated. I stared at the screen, trying to process what this meant for my future. "Where did it all go?" "That's where it gets interesting," Patricia said, pulling up another screen. "About $75,000 went to support Ms. Miller rent payments, car payments, credit card bills, plus some direct cash transfers. But the bulk of it, nearly $250,000, went to a man named Vincent Torino." The name meant nothing to me. "Who is Vincent Torino?" Patricia's expression grew grim. "That's what I was hoping you could tell me. Because based on what I can find, Mr. Torino isn't someone your husband did business with through his construction company. And the payment pattern suggests this wasn't a legitimate business transaction." She showed me a timeline of transfers, payments that had started small 6 months ago and escalated dramatically in the weeks before Robert's death. "This looks like someone paying off a debt," she said. "The kind of debt that comes with penalties for late payment." I studied the numbers, seeing the pattern she was describing. The early payments were $5,000, then $10,000, then increasingly larger amounts until Robert was transferring $25,000 at a time in his final weeks. "You think Robert owed this man money?" "I think your husband was being extorted," Patricia said bluntly. The payment pattern, the escalating amounts, the way he liquidated assets to get cash quickly, it all points to someone being pressured to pay up and fast. Extorted. The word hung in the air between us, carrying implications I didn't want to face. What could Robert have done that would make him vulnerable to extortion? What secret could have been worth nearly $250,000 to keep hidden? "There's something else," Patricia continued. "The final payment to Torino was made 3 days before your husband's death. $25,000, transferred electronically from an account Robert had opened specifically for these transactions. 3 days before his heart attack. I thought about Robert in those final days, how distracted he'd been, how he'd been working late, and seemed stressed about something he wouldn't discuss. I'd attributed it to problems with a difficult client, but now I wondered if he'd been dealing with something much more serious. Do you have any idea what Vincent Torino might have had on your husband?" Patricia asked gently. I shook my head, though even as I did, possibilities were beginning to form in my mind. The affair with Vanessa was the obvious answer, but would Robert have paid $250,000 to keep that secret? There had to be something else, something worse. "What do we do now?" I asked. "I think you need to talk to the police," Patricia said. "If your husband was being extorted, that's a serious crime. And if this Torino character was putting pressure on Robert," she didn't finish the sentence, but I could fill in the blanks. If Vincent Torino had been extorting Robert, and if Robert's sudden death had cut off the flow of money, what would happen next? "You think I might be in danger?" "I think you need to be careful," Patricia said. "Extortionists don't usually just walk away when their source of income disappears. They might try to collect from Robert's estate, or they might have information they think they can sell to someone else." The thought of being targeted by whoever had been terrorizing Robert made my hands shake. I'd spent the past week learning to live with the reality of his infidelity, but this was something else entirely. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, her voice becoming even more serious. "The account Robert was using to pay Torino, it wasn't closed after his death. Someone made a withdrawal from it yesterday." "What kind of withdrawal?" $500 from an ATM in downtown Minneapolis. Someone who has access to that account is still using it. The implications hit me like a cold wave. Either Robert wasn't dead, which was impossible, or someone else had access to a secret account. Someone who might know about Vincent Torino and the extortion. "I need to call the police," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Patricia nodded. "I'll come with you if you'd like. And Catherine, until we know more about the situation, you might want to consider staying somewhere else for a few days. Just as a precaution." The drive home from Patricia's office passed in a blur of traffic and racing thoughts. I kept checking my rearview mirror, wondering if I was being followed, if Vincent Torino or his associates were already watching me. Every car that stayed behind me for more than a few blocks made my heart race. Lisa was waiting at the house when I arrived, and I could see the concern in her face the moment she saw my expression. "What did you find out?" she asked. I sat at the kitchen table and told her everything: the extortion, the $250,000, the mysterious Vincent Torino, the ATM withdrawal that suggested someone was still accessing Robert's secret account. Lisa listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. "Mom, this is serious," she said when I finished. "We need to call the police right now." I knew she was right, but part of me was still resisting the idea of involving law enforcement. Once we called the police, this would become official, a matter of public record. Robert's secrets would be exposed not just to our family, but to investigators, reporters, anyone who cared to look. But the alternative, living in fear, not knowing who might come looking for the money Robert could no longer pay, was worse. Detective Ray Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd heard every kind of human story. He came to the house that evening with a younger partner, Detective Lisa Chong, and they spent 2 hours going through Patricia Wells' findings and taking notes about everything we knew. "Vincent Torino," Morrison said when I mentioned the name, and I saw him exchange a look with his partner. "We know Mr. Torino. He runs what he calls a financial consulting business, but we've been watching him for years." "What kind of financial consulting?" I asked. "The kind that involves lending money to people who can't get traditional loans, then charging them very high interest rates," Detective Chong explained. "And when people can't pay, Mr. Torino gets creative about collection methods." "You mean he's a loan shark?" "Among other things," Morrison said. "But in your husband's case, the payment pattern suggests something different. This looks more like blackmail than loan repayment." The word I'd been avoiding finally spoken out loud. Blackmail. Someone had been blackmailing my husband, and Robert had paid nearly $250,000 to keep some secret hidden. "Do you have any idea what Torino might have had on your husband?" Chong asked. I told them about the affair with Vanessa, about the financial irregularities we discovered, about Robert's changed behavior in his final months. But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't enough. The affair was humiliating, but it wasn't criminal. There had to be something else. "We'll need to talk to Ms. Miller," Morrison said, making notes. "And we'll want to examine your husband's computer, his phone records, anything that might give us insight into what Torino had on him." "His computer is missing," I said. "His laptop, his phone, some of his tools and jewelry, they all disappeared sometime before he died." The detectives exchanged another look. "That suggests your husband was trying to eliminate evidence of something," Chong said. "The question is what?" They gave me their cards and instructions to call immediately if I noticed anything suspicious: strange cars in the neighborhood, unexpected phone calls, anyone asking questions about Robert or his business. They also suggested I stay with friends or family for a few days, just as a precaution. That night, Lisa and I packed bags and drove to my sister Janet's house in St. Paul. Janet was 5 years older than me, divorced, with 2 grown children and a spare bedroom that she insisted I use for as long as necessary. "I can't believe Robert got involved with people like this," Janet said as we sat in her living room, drinking tea and trying to process everything that had happened. "It's not like him." But was it? I'd thought the affair wasn't like Robert either, yet he'd managed to maintain a secret relationship for 2 years. I'd thought his financial responsibility was unshakable, yet he'd liquidated hundreds of thousands of dollars without telling me. How well had I really known my husband? "Maybe it started small," I said. "Maybe he needed money for the affair and couldn't figure out how to get it without me noticing. So he borrowed from Vincent Torino, and then Torino had him trapped," Lisa finished. "The moment Dad took that first loan, Torino owned him." It was a plausible scenario, and it explained why Robert had seemed so stressed and distracted in his final months. He'd been caught between his secret life with Vanessa and his obligations to a dangerous man who had no patience for late payments. But there was still something that didn't fit. If Robert had just needed money for the affair, why had he liquidated so much more than what he'd given to Vanessa? The payments to Torino had been nearly 4 times larger than what he'd spent on his mistress. The answer came the next morning, in a phone call from Detective Morrison. "We found something," he said without preamble. "Can you come down to the station? There's something we need to show you." The Minneapolis Police Department's downtown headquarters was a fortress-like building that made me feel small and vulnerable. Morrison and Chong met us in a conference room with fluorescent lighting and no windows, the kind of space designed for difficult conversations. "We executed a search warrant on Vincent Torino's office last night," Morrison explained. "Found some interesting files, including one with your husband's name on it." He opened a manila folder and spread out several documents, bank statements, photographs, and what looked like surveillance reports. "Torino wasn't just lending your husband money," Chong said. "He was documenting everything Robert did, everyone he met with, every financial transaction he made. He was building a comprehensive file on your husband's activities." I picked up one of the photographs and my breath caught. It was Robert and Vanessa sitting together at a restaurant I didn't recognize. They were leaning close to each other, her hand covering his on the table, both of them smiling. It was the kind of intimate moment that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. "There are dozens of these," Morrison said. "Photos of your husband with Ms. Miller, records of his financial transactions, even surveillance notes about his daily routine. Torino was essentially stalking your husband, building evidence of his affair." "But why?" I asked. "If he was just blackmailing Robert about the affair, why did he need all this documentation?" Chong pulled out another set of papers. "Because it wasn't just about the affair. Look at this." The documents were bank records, but not for accounts I recognized. They showed large cash deposits and withdrawals, transfers between accounts in different names, and a complex web of financial transactions that made no sense to me. "Your husband was laundering money," Morrison said quietly. "Torino was using Robert's construction business to clean cash from his various illegal activities. The affair was just leverage to make sure Robert cooperated. Money laundering." The words hit me like a physical blow, worse than learning about the affair, worse than discovering the blackmail. Robert hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been a criminal. How long was this going on? I managed to ask. "Based on these records, about 2 years," Chong said. "Right around the time the affair with Ms. Miller began. Torino probably discovered the relationship through his surveillance activities, then used it to pressure your husband into participating in the money laundering operation." I thought about Robert's construction business, how proud he'd been of building it from nothing, how careful he'd always been about maintaining its reputation. The idea that he'd allowed it to be used for criminal activities seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of me. "Did Tom know?" I asked, thinking of Robert's business partner. "Was he involved in this?" "We don't think so," Morrison said. "The money laundering was handled through separate accounts and shell companies that Mr. Rodriguez wouldn't have had access to. Your husband went to great lengths to keep the illegal activities separate from the legitimate business. At least there was that. Tom had been my husband's partner and friend for 15 years. If he'd been involved in the money laundering, it would have been yet another betrayal to process." "What happens now?" Lisa asked. "Now we build a case against Vincent Torino," Chong said. "The evidence we found in his office gives us enough to charge him with extortion, money laundering, and probably several other crimes. But we'll need your cooperation." "What kind of cooperation?" "We'll need you to testify about what you've discovered about your husband's finances," Morrison explained. "And we'll need access to any records or documents you haven't already provided." The thought of testifying in court, of having Robert's secrets exposed in public testimony, made me feel sick. But I knew I didn't have a choice. Torino had destroyed my husband's life and my family's financial security. He deserved to face the consequences. "There's something else," Chong said. "The ATM withdrawal from your husband's account. We traced it to one of Torino's associates. Someone named Carl Brennan, who works for Torino as a collector." "A collector?" "The guy who visits people when they're late with their payments," Morrison explained grimly. "The fact that he's still accessing your husband's account suggests he might be planning to continue collecting from the estate. The idea that someone might try to extort money from me the way they'd extorted it from Robert made my blood run cold. "What do I do if he contacts me?" "You call us immediately," Chong said, handing me another business card. "And you don't engage with him at all. Don't try to negotiate. Don't try to explain that your husband is dead. Just call us." As we left the police station, I felt like I was walking through a different world than the one I'd entered. 2 weeks ago, I'd been a suburban wife and mother, dealing with the normal challenges of a long marriage and raising children. Now I was a widow whose husband had been involved with money laundering, extortion, and organized crime. "Mom," Lisa said as we got in the car, "I'm scared." I was scared too, but I was also angry. Angry at Robert for getting involved with Vincent Torino, for putting our family at risk, for dying before he could clean up the mess he'd made. Angry at myself for being so blind to what was happening in my own house, my own marriage. But mostly I was determined. Robert's secrets had already cost us our financial security and our peace of mind. I wasn't going to let them cost us anything else. "We're going to get through this," I told Lisa, and for the first time since Robert's death, I actually believed it. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls with lawyers, meetings with prosecutors, and the surreal experience of learning that my quiet suburban life had been built on a foundation of lies. The media picked up the story, local businessman involved in money laundering scheme, and suddenly our family's tragedy became public entertainment. I stopped reading the news articles and avoided social media entirely. The comment sections were full of speculation about what I'd known, and when I'd known it, armchair detectives convinced that no wife could be that oblivious to her husband's criminal activities. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have questioned Robert's changed behavior more aggressively, should have demanded answers when he started working late and acting secretive. But hindsight is perfect, and at the time, I trusted the man I'd been married to for over 2 decades. Vincent Torino was arrested on a Thursday morning at his office in downtown Minneapolis. The news showed him being led away in handcuffs, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked more like an accountant than a criminal mastermind. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The files in his office contained documentation of dozens of extortion schemes and money laundering operations going back years. Carl Brennan, the man who'd been accessing Robert's account, was picked up the same day. According to Detective Morrison, he'd been planning to approach me directly to demand continued payments, apparently believing that Robert's death didn't end his family's obligation to Vincent Torino. The trial wouldn't happen for months, but the immediate threat to my safety was over. For the first time since Robert's death, I could sleep without wondering if someone was watching the house, waiting for an opportunity to demand money I didn't have. 3 weeks after the arrests, I finally went home. Lisa had returned to Denver, promising to visit soon. Michael had called every day from college, worried about me but relieved that the danger was over. The house felt differente, smaller, somehow, and quieter than I remembered. I stood in the kitchen where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations, where we'd planned vacations and worried about mortgage payments and celebrated the kids' achievements. So much of what I thought was real had turned out to be illusion, but this physical space where we'd build our daily life was still here. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but no longer terrifying. I would have to rebuild my financial security, find a way to support myself that didn't depend on Robert's tainted legacy. I would have to figure out who I was as a single woman at 50, how to create meaning and purpose in a life that looked nothing like what I'd planned. But I would survive this. Robert's secrets had cost me my marriage, my financial security, and my faith in my own judgment. They'd exposed me to danger and humiliation and forced me to question everything I'd believed about my life. But they hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, still standing, still capable of building something new from the ruins of what I'd lost. In the end, that was Robert's final gift to me, not the money he'd squandered or the life insurance he'd left behind, but the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. Strong enough to face the truth, no matter how painful. Strong enough to start over at 50, to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. I walked through the house one more time, turning off lights and locking doors. Tomorrow I would start making phone calls to real estate agents about selling the house that held too many memories, to employment counselors about finding work after 23 years of being a stay-at-home mom, to financial advisors about managing what was left of our assets after Robert's criminal activities were fully accounted for. It wouldn't be easy. Starting over never is, especially when you're doing it alone and at an age when most people are thinking about retirement rather than new careers. But as I stood in the doorway of the house where I'd thought I was living one kind of life while actually living another entirely, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Robert died: hope. The woman who had sat in Mr. Harrison's office 3 weeks ago, listening to her husband's will being read, had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. She believed in her marriage, trusted in her financial security, and thought she understood the man she'd shared her life with for over 2 decades. That woman was gone, destroyed by revelations that had shattered everything she thought she knew about her existence. But in her place stood someone else, someone who had looked directly into the darkness of betrayal and criminality and survived. Someone who had faced the worst possible truths about the person she'd loved most and found the strength to keep going. I turned off the porch light and walked to my car, not looking back at the house that had once represented everything I thought I wanted from life. Ahead of me lay uncertainty, challenges, and the hard work of rebuilding from scratch. But I was ready for it. 6 months later, I sat in a small apartment in downtown Minneapolis, watching the sun set over the Mississippi River through windows that faced west instead of east. The apartment was a fraction of the size of the suburban house I'd shared with Robert, but it was mine, purchased with money I'd earned at the nonprofit where I'd found work as a program coordinator, furnished with pieces I'd chosen because I liked them rather than because they matched some predetermined aesthetic. The trial of Vincent Torino had ended the week before with guilty verdicts on all counts: money laundering, extortion, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that would keep him in federal prison for the next 20 years. Carl Brennan had pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the entire criminal enterprise that had destroyed my husband's life had finally been dismantled. The media attention had been intense but brief. The public's fascination with suburban crime stories burns bright but fades quickly, and by the time the trial ended, our family's tragedy had been replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrages. I was grateful for the anonymity that allowed me to rebuild my life without constant scrutiny. Lisa and Michael had both struggled with the revelations about their father, but they were young and resilient in ways that I envied. Lisa had thrown herself into her career with renewed determination, as if professional success could somehow balance the scales against personal disappointment. Michael had changed his major from business to social work, telling me that he wanted to help people instead of just making money, a decision that suggested he'd learned something valuable from his father's mistakes. We talked regularly, the three of us, but we rarely spoke about Robert. That part of our lives felt sealed off, like a room in a house that had been permanently closed. Maybe someday we'd be able to open that door again, to find a way to remember the good parts of the man we'd all loved without being overwhelmed by the terrible things he'd done. But for now, it was enough to focus on moving forward. Vanessa Miller had moved to Portland, Oregon, using Robert's bequest to start fresh in a city where nobody knew her story. She'd sent me a letter before she left, apologizing again for her role in the destruction of my marriage and thanking me for allowing her to keep the money Robert had left her. I'd written back, wishing her well and meaning it. We'd both been victims of Robert's deception in our own ways, and there seemed little point in maintaining anger towards someone whose life had been as thoroughly disrupted as my own. The money laundering investigation had revealed the full extent of Robert's financial crimes. Over $1 million had been processed through his business accounts over the course of 2 years, generating fees that Vincent Torino had allowed Robert to keep as compensation for his cooperation. The federal government had seized those profits as proceeds of criminal activity, leaving me with far less than I'd originally expected from Robert's estate. But it was enough. Combined with my new income and careful budgeting, I could maintain a modest but comfortable lifestyle. More importantly, I could sleep at night knowing that every dollar I spent had been earned honestly, that my security wasn't built on someone else's criminal enterprise. The hardest part hadn't been the financial adjustment or even the public humiliation. The hardest part had been learning to trust my own judgment again, to believe that I could navigate the world without constantly second-guessing my perceptions and decisions. Robert's betrayal had shattered my confidence in my ability to read people, to understand what was really happening in my own life. But slowly, carefully, I was rebuilding that confidence. The work at the nonprofit had helped. Managing programs that provided support to families in crisis had reminded me that I was competent, that I had skills and insights that could make a difference in other people's lives. The small victories of helping a single mother find affordable housing or connecting an unemployed father with job training resources had gradually restored my faith in my own abilities. I'd even started dating tentatively, cautiously, with the kind of careful attention to red flags that comes from hard-won experience. Nothing serious yet, just coffee dates and casual dinners with men I'd met through work or friends. But the fact that I was open to the possibility of companionship again felt like progress. The sun had set completely while I'd been lost in thought, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle on the water below. I made myself a simple dinner pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market, a glass of wine from a bottle I'd opened because I felt like it, not because it was a special occasion, and sat at my small table looking out at the view. This wasn't the life I'd planned. At 50, I'd expected to be settled in comfortable middle age, probably thinking about grandchildren and retirement planning, secure in a marriage that I'd assumed would last until death do us part. Instead, I was essentially starting over, building a new identity as a single woman with a career and an apartment and no idea what the future might hold. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the modest comforts I'd created for myself, I realized something surprising. I liked this life. I liked the independence, the sense that every choice I made was my own, the knowledge that I was supporting myself through honest work rather than depending on someone else's questionable decisions. I liked knowing that when I went to sleep at night, I didn't have to wonder what secrets the person beside me might be hiding. I liked being able to trust my own instincts again, to make plans without worrying that they might be undermined by revelations I couldn't anticipate. Most of all, I liked the person I was becoming: stronger, more self-reliant, less willing to accept easy answers or comfortable illusions. The woman who had sat in Mr. Harrison's office, listening to her husband's, had been living a lie without knowing it. The woman who sat in this apartment, watching the lights reflect on the river, was living a truth she'd created for herself. It wasn't the life I'd expected, but it was authentically mine in a way that my marriage had never been. And after everything I'd been through, authenticity felt like the most valuable gift I could give myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "How are you doing tonight, Mom?" I smiled as I typed back, "I'm good, really good." And for the first time since that devastating day in the lawyer's office when I'd learned the truth about my husband's secret life, I meant it completely. The past would always be part of my story: the betrayal, the criminal enterprise, the shattering of everything I'd thought I knew about my own life. But it no longer defined my future. That was mine to write, one honest choice at a time. Outside my window, the city stretched out in all directions, full of possibilities I was finally ready to explore. The reading that had destroyed my old life had also, in its way, set me free to create a new one. And that, I thought as I finished my wine and prepared for bed, might be the most unexpected gift of all.